As I mentioned to the children, we've been working through this series on mental health and the gospel, and today's going to be our last message in that series, and starting next Sunday, we're going to be doing a verse-by-verse study through the book of Ephesians. But there is one more sort of theme or topic that I think would be helpful to explore in this series, and so today we're going to be reading John chapter 11, starting at verse 17, and if you have your Bible, you can turn there now, John 11, verse 17. If you're following along in the Bibles in the pews, you can turn to page 1063, and you'll find it there. Let's hear the word of the Lord together. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world." And after she said this, she went back and called her sister, Mary, aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and he's asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" And may the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. When our kids were all between the ages of 5 and 8, we took them to Florida for spring break this year, and while we were there, we decided to take a day trip to the beach. It was one of those like super crowded beaches, you know, the ones that are all crammed with sun umbrellas and strewn with beach towels. And me and Danny and our 3 kids, and also my 2 in-laws and their 3 kids were all there, 10 of us, just enjoying ourselves and having a time. Until suddenly somebody says, "Where's Rachel?" And we all look around, and she is nowhere to be seen. Now, in case you have never lost a 5-year-old on a crowded beach before, let me describe the feeling to you. It's like this bottomless pit opens up in your stomach, and you are falling down inside yourself into it. And you look up and down the beaches frantically, but you cannot see anything through that sea of umbrellas, right? And your mind is like racing with possible explanations for what has happened to her, and none of them are good. Maybe the best word for it is grief. Not in the strictest sense, of course, like we weren't technically grieving her, but you talk to anyone who has been through real grief, and they will describe all of the same feelings as I tasted in that moment. The fear, the anguish, the desperation. The only difference, of course, is that our grief did not last very long, because we were only a few seconds into it when this guy sitting on a beach towel a few yards away, he sees us frantically searching and he calls out, "Hey, are you looking for a little girl? I saw her wander over this way and I've been keeping an eye on her until her parents found her." And so we go rushing over and we hold her as close as we can. And as soon as we can all breathe again, we ask her, "What happened?" And Rachel says, "Well, I was playing a game called Where's My Seashell?, where I'd throw the seashell into the water and then go in and try to find it. And then after a little bit, I started playing a game called Where's My Mommy?" It's actually sort of a legend in the Harris family now. The day Rachel played the game called Where's My Mommy? But let me go back to my grief again, just for a quick second. Because I'm a Christian, right? Like I believe the words of the creed in the resurrection of the dead and in the life everlasting. But even so, if you were to have strolled up to me while I was desperately searching for Rachel, and you were to have said something like, "Well, don't worry, you will get to be with her at the resurrection of the dead on the last day." Or, "Well, it's okay, you will be with her in heaven." I mean, if you had said that to me in that moment, well, the politest thing I can think to say is that it would not have been very helpful. Like just because those things are true, and they are objectively true, still, they would not have helped me in my grief at that point. Would they have? Because having hope doesn't mean, does it? It doesn't mean that you don't get to grieve. That is certainly what Jesus showed us the day he stood outside the tomb of his friend Lazarus, while Lazarus' sisters sobbed, their hearts empty. That having hope doesn't mean that you don't get to grieve. Because I'll tell you, if anyone had hope that day, it was Jesus. I mean, when he first got the news that Lazarus was sick, like back when this story started, Jesus' immediate response was, quote, "This sickness will not end in death. Instead, the Son of God will be glorified through it." He was so confident, actually, that Lazarus was going to be okay, that he didn't even go off and see him right away. Like to the bafflement of his disciples, he waited for 2 days, and it's only after he knows for sure that Lazarus has died, then he says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I am going there to wake him up." Now that's all kind of cryptic stuff, but the point is, Jesus has every intention of bringing Lazarus back from the dead. Which, if you aren't familiar with this story, you should know that that is how the story ends. In just a few verses after the point where we left off, he's going to arrive at the tomb and he is going to bring Lazarus back to life, like literally and physically raise him from the dead. And yet, I want you to notice that his hope doesn't mean that he doesn't get to grieve the death of his best friend. I mean, you read it with me, right? What does he do? What does he do when he sees everyone mourning and he is confronted with the reality that Lazarus really is dead? Like even though he is absolutely convinced that Lazarus is going to live again, still, what does he do in verse 35? Because he dearly, dearly loved Lazarus. Jesus wept. It is famously the shortest verse in the English Bible. 2 simple words. And yet it might very well be the hugest statement, like the weightiest 2 words in the whole entire good book. Whitby Church, Jesus wept at the grave of his friend. By the way, Buckle up, because we're going to do a little bit of Greek today. If you study this verse in depth, you sometimes come across the idea that Jesus was just crying soft, silent tears here. That the word that John uses to describe Jesus weeping, in Greek the word is drakuo, that this word means quiet weeping instead of like loud sobbing. Has anyone heard that before? Well, if you ever come across that idea, let me just say that it's not really true. The word drakuo just means to shed tears, but it doesn't say anything about how intense those tears are. To figure that out, you have to look at the wider context of how the word is being used. And actually, the only other examples we have of this word in the Bible is found in the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. And there, the word drakuo is always coupled with words that imply deep anguish, what we might call open sobbing. As just one example, in Job chapter 3, verse 24, Job says, "Why was I ever born? Because sighing comes to me instead of food, and my groans pour out like water." And in the ancient Greek translation of that verse from the Hebrew, it uses the word drakuo to describe Job's groaning. The ones that are pouring out of him like water, it's the same word that John 11:35 uses when it says, Jesus wept. So, just in case you have some like sentimental picture in your mind of Jesus, just kind of blinking away a tear or two before regaining his composure and getting to work, understand that that is not the picture that John is trying to paint here. Because the other phrase that he uses is enebremesato to pneumati. Sorry, it's 2 for 1 day down at Crazy Dale's House of Greek Terms. Enebremesato to pneumati. It's that bit there in verse 33 where it says, he was deeply moved, which is as good a translation as any, I guess, but the phrase is actually kind of difficult to make sense of. The key word is that enebremesato, which usually means something like to get angry or indignant, often with some kind of expression of anger, like a snort or a groan, right? Okay, think of the sound you make when you're watching Hockey Night in Canada and the ref makes a bad call. Everyone can hear that sound? Think that times 1,000. The to pneumati part means in his spirit. So, if he was angry, it was an internal kind of anger. He was snorting in his heart, so to speak, which maybe captures the literal meaning of the phrase, but it does raise a tricky question. Why would Jesus be angry in this moment, of all moments? So some scholars think he's angry because, all of the weeping and the wailing that everyone's doing shows that they lack faith, that they just don't believe that Lazarus is going to live again. But I'll say that does not make any sense to me whatsoever. Everyone in the story says that if Jesus had been there, Lazarus wouldn't have died. So clearly they believe he has miraculous power. And in verse 24, Martha says that she believes that he is the Son of God. He can do anything, and that Lazarus will rise again at the resurrection. So it is not faith that they lack. They just don't understand what Jesus is planning to do here. Some scholars suggest that what he's angry at is just all of the pain and the indignity of death itself. Like he's angry to see how death has wreaked so much misery among his friends and has caused so much heartache for everyone. That's getting us closer, I think, to what's going on here. But still, Jesus has seen death before. So this moment can't be coming as a shock to him. And anyways, verse 33 says that his anger was in his own spirit, which means it's something that he is feeling personally, himself, not just for Martha and all the rest. Like Jesus is churning inside, churning over the fact that his beloved friend is dead. That's the closest I can get to making sense of enabremesato to pneumati. Call it anger. Call it grief. Call it whatever you want. But he is churning inside, and that churning is bubbling up out of him. It's why I prefer the old King James translation of verse 33, which puts it like this. Jesus groaned in his spirit and was troubled. I prefer that translation not just because of what the word enembresato means. I prefer it because I think I have heard that groaning myself before. Some of you may know that when my wife Danny was only 17, back when I had just started dating her, she lost her mother very suddenly after a very rare kind of heart attack. Like no one saw it coming. One night, her dad told the kids, Mom's not feeling too well, and he's going to take her to the hospital. And a couple hours later, he calls Danny in total shock and explains that Mom didn't make it. Like to say that Danny was devastated in the days after that it's kind of like saying New York was sad after 9/11. Like, I mean, her whole world was turned inside out in a matter of minutes. And she had only recently become a Christian, too. Like later she says, she prayed the first real prayer she had ever prayed in her life. It was the night her dad took her mom to the hospital, and she prayed that Mom would be okay. Like, so needless to say, in the days that followed that, hope was very hard for Danny to come by. Like, even the idea of hope was a very painful subject. And I was a Christian too, right? I certainly had hope, but still, I was only 17, you know? I had no idea whatsoever what to do with Danny's pain. But I will never forget that night. It was like maybe 3 months into her grief. And Danny and I were sort of away on a youth retreat weekend. We'd gone on this youth retreat together. And she had kind of slipped away to the far corner of the church because she just could not bear to be around people. And she was kind of lying there on the floor, you know, sort of crying softly in the dark. And then I came in and I sat next to her, and I had no clue what on earth to say. I put my hand on her shoulder, and we just sat there in silence for a bit. I can still hear it. And suddenly, Danny let out this deep moan. It was a groan that I can only describe as the sound of utter anguish. It was like a sob coming from the very core of who she was. And I don't know this for sure, but when I read John 11:33, I am pretty convinced that what Jesus is doing there in this moment is kind of something like the groan that Danny offered up for her mom that night. Or a different way to say it is her groan was something like what Jesus was offering up for Lazarus that day, a sob coming from the very core of who he is. Because Whitby Church, having hope doesn't mean you don't get to grieve. I say it like that. It doesn't mean we don't get to grieve, because my hunch is that a lot of times in the church, whether it's intentional or not, a lot of times we give off the idea that Christians shouldn't grieve, or at least we should put a limit on the amount of groaning we're allowed to do. Some of you may know that we do a grief support group here at Whitby Church on a semi-regular basis. It's called Grief Share, and we just try to make space for people who are in grief to talk about what they're going through. And part of Grief Share includes these teaching videos where, they interview people who have gone through grief to try to help the group understand how normal their experience is. But one of the things that comes up over and over again in these interviews is how difficult it can be for people who are grieving to go to church. Because when they're there, everything about it makes them think that they shouldn't be grieving, and there's no place for their sadness. I remember reading an article written by a woman who had recently lost her husband, and then shortly after that, she had received a cancer diagnosis herself. And she was a Christian, of course. She was writing this article as a Christian. But she went to this really happy-clappy kind of church. The ones where the joy of the Lord is always everybody's strength and no one say anything different, that kind of a church. And there was this really popular song at her church called Yes, Lord, Yes, Lord. You may have heard this song before. If not, the verse goes like this. I'm trading my sorrow, I'm trading my pain, I'm laying them down for the joy of the Lord. And the chorus goes, yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord. And in the article, this lady was like, I believe in Jesus deeply, but it is torment for me to stand there and hear everyone singing, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, when everything inside of me wants to scream, no, Lord. No, Lord. No, no, no. There's actually a word for this in grief therapy. We call it disenfranchised grief. A disenfranchised grief is any grief where our culture does not fully acknowledge the pain of it. Or maybe our community sends us the message that we should not be as sad about it as we are, or deal with it in the way that we are dealing with it. It's disenfranchised, right? It's disempowered grief. And because it is, they have found, disenfranchised grief can be even more painful and more difficult to heal from than our more socially acceptable kinds of grief. You might have disenfranchised grief if the person whom you loved died of something that is socially stigmatized, like drug addiction maybe, or HIV. Or if the person you loved was, quote, just a friend, or, quote, just a colleague as far as anyone else was concerned. But for you, they were far, far more than that. Or if the person died after a prolonged illness, maybe, and everyone is saying, you should be happy that they're not suffering anymore. Like these kinds of griefs can all be examples of disenfranchised grief. And so can the grief we feel as Christians if our faith or our faith community tells us that because we have hope, we shouldn't be grieving. And if this is resonating with you at all today, then let me tell you the good news one more time. Our Lord Jesus Christ stood at the graveside of his beloved. And even though he knew he was the resurrection and the life, and everyone who believes in him will not perish and will have everlasting life, And even though his promise to Martha was a guaranteed hope as far as he was concerned, and he knew that Lazarus would live again, even though, Whitby Church, Jesus wept. And even though all of those promises are still true for us, I mean, death does not get the last word. And he will wipe every tear from every eye in the end. And even though that hope can transform the way we think about death, and it does transform the way we think about death, because we know that it's not final, and we know that it doesn't win. Even so, that doesn't mean we can't groan in our spirits, deeply groan, if that's where our grief takes us. I want to offer you that today as a way of maybe enfranchising your grief. If you have been carrying something that needs groaning and you haven't yet received the permission to grieve it. I mean, like this series this month has been all about mental health and the gospel, right? But we are ending the series here with this message on grief for reasons that I hope are obvious. On the one hand, mental health challenges can be among the most disenfranchised kinds of grief of all. I mean, because of stigma and silence and prejudice against the mentally ill, it can be hard. Especially in the church, it can be hard to give ourselves permission to grieve what we might be going through. But on the other hand, grief is its own kind of mental health challenge. At least it certainly can become one. And that's especially true when we think it's not okay to grieve the way we need to. So for both of those reasons, I want to end this series here with Jesus weeping at the tomb of his dearly beloved friend. Because Whitby Church, whatever else was happening that day, that was God assuring us that we are never alone when we grieve, and he is near to the brokenhearted. It kind of had me thinking this week about the merry adventures of Robin Hood. Now, after everything we've touched on today, please understand I'm only offering this as an analogy, not to make light of anything. But The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood was my all-time favorite book when I was a kid. Now, the Howard Pyle version, mind you, with all of the these and the thous and the come hithers and the over yonders all left in. I probably read it 36 times when I was in grade 5. Absolutely riveted each time by all of the archery contests and all of the quarterstaff bouts. But there was one chapter that I always hated to read, even though I knew I had to every time I read it. It was the epilogue, also known as the death of Robin Hood. People are often surprised to learn that Robin Hood does die in the story, although it only comes after many years of adventuring. You see, later in life, he falls ill with some mysterious sickness, and so he goes to his cousin, the Prioress of Kirklees, who's going to do some old-fashioned medieval bloodletting on him to try to cure him. But what Robin Hood doesn't know is that his cousin wants to win favor with the king, right? And so she secretly cuts the deepest vein in his arm instead of the surface vein she's supposed to. And then she locks the room and she leaves him there to bleed out. Well, after lying there for a couple of hours, Robin Hood realizes what has happened and that his hour has come. And so he drags himself to the window and he blows his bugle horn to summon his trusty Little John, who has been waiting outside the priory the whole time. Little John hears the horn and he bursts into the room only to find Robin Hood teetering on the threshold between life and death. He rushes over to him and he cradles him in his arms, weeping tender tears over his master as Robin Hood breathes his final breath. I can still remember the first night I ever read that as a kid. I was like maybe 10, and I had sat up late into the night to finish the book. And when it was done, I was gutted. Like I couldn't say why, but it opened up a hole in my heart that I did not know how to deal with. And I started sobbing, like really sobbing. My dad actually heard it in the next room, and he came in to see what was the matter. And I couldn't tell him. Like how does a 10-year-old put it into words that he is crying because he just realized for the first time that death is real and death is horrible. And we lose people we love. Well, to his credit, my dad did not disenfranchise my grief. He just took me in his arms and he kissed me on the head and he told me it's okay to cry, which is probably the best thing he could have done and the thing that I most needed. Does that make sense? He didn't say something dismissive, like, what's the big deal? It's just a book. He gave me what I needed and he let me cry. If that does make sense, then maybe it will make sense when I say that that is something like what Jesus wants to do for us when we are in grief. Whitby Church, he will not say something dismissive. Like, what's the big deal? Don't you have hope? Not the Jesus who wept at Lazarus' tomb. He won't do that. Instead, when we give our grief to him, he promises to give us what we need and hold us while we grieve.